Today I'll be reflecting on my dissertation project where I studied handicraft artisans and how they set prices for their products. So let me start by talking about getting to the field. So I did not choose the specific research question prior to entering the field. I chose the phenomenon and the setting, which was handicraft artisans, and I found handicraft production in general to be a really fascinating setting because this was the second largest employment category in India, and these were mostly low income workers who were very skilled because they had a lot of tacit knowledge and they were able to make these products from start to finish. And yet they weren't being rewarded by sort of being well paid in their specific industry. And so I was really interested, at looking at this intersection between low income work and yet skilled work. And so I chose handicraft artisans as sort of my dissertation topic, and I left it at that and sort of figured that inductively the interesting questions would emerge. Once I chose that particular setting, it still took me a while to figure out where in India and which particular handicraft cluster I would study. So I started out my field work spending a couple of weeks to a month in several different handicraft clusters around India. And while doing that field work, important themes that I thought would sort of influence and drive my research started becoming salient. That helped me pick Channapatna, the wooden lacquerware cluster in the south of India that ended up being the site for the bulk of my dissertation fieldwork. So, in designing my fieldwork, initially, I decided that I would spend as much time as I could with artisans as well as traders because while I started doing fieldwork, I realized that these were the two predominant actors in the field, where the artisans are making the products and selling them also, and the traders specialize in selling these products. So I structured my time to make sure I was stratifying my sample where I'm observing different kinds of artisans, wealthier ones, poorer ones, people from different religious backgrounds, different levels of education, and similarly with traders. And as I did that, sort of the research questions sort of became important, and that allowed me to then structure the rest of my fieldwork. But initially, that's how I designed my fieldwork. And negotiating access was not particularly difficult in this field because it's an informal sector in India. So it's not a formal organization. And so I didn't really have to go to any large, company and talk to their management about getting access. So in that sense, it was easier. That also posed a little bit of a challenge because it meant that I had to negotiate access individually with a lot of individual artisans and traders. And so for me, once I had spent a few weeks in Channapatna, because it was a small town, I became sort of a familiar face and most people recognized me. And they knew I was staying there. So that made it a lot easier because people would have heard about me from their friends, and people even started anticipating that I would come and visit them. And the few people whom I didn't talk to initially would come and ask me, "Why haven't you come and visited me? And come and shadow me and spend a day with me as well." So trust built over time, even though access was relatively easy. And the one sort of thing that, when I reflect, was also important here is who I was also made a difference. So this was a predominantly male setting, and these were mostly middle aged men. And I was a young woman and a student at that point, and actually helped with access as well as gaining trust because the artisans and traders saw me as being relatively harmless. That what is she going to do? She's not really going to report us or do anything harmful to us. But at the same time, because I was a student, they valued education a lot because they saw education as a pathway to mobility and sort of to means outside of their poverty situation. They really wanted to help out because they thought if they helped the student project, they were overall doing a really nice thing. My first day doing field work, I still remember my first day. It's always in every setting. The first days are always challenging because you've prepared and you've read a lot about the setting and both theory and a lot of press articles, but you haven't actually been there. And so for me, what I remember the most about my first day was that I was coughing incessantly because there was a lot of sawdust in the air, And I had not thought about that before, even though this was a wooden lacquer cluster, and I knew that people are carving these objects. I did not anticipate how much sawdust was going to be in the air, and I did not bring a bottle of water with me, which meant that my throat was dry, and but within a few hours, I think I had to just stop for the day because I couldn't talk anymore. I was just like continuously coughing. But it got better, obviously. I think I became immune to the sawdust, and I also learned how to prevent sort of being affected by it. But things like that do tend to happen on first days, just because you don't know what to expect. But I think it's all right as long as you're persevering and you learn from that first day and sort of move on from there. So I developed very deep relationships with the people in my setting. I became sort of the daughter of the town, just because most of the people were older than me. All the artisans and traders sort of saw me as, a child figure. And so over time, people would often be concerned about, have I eaten my meals? Am I concerned? I mean, am I safe where I'm living? And they were concerned about my well-being in a way that went far beyond our professional relationship. Um, so I structured my time where I spent about 3 or 4 days in the field, so 3 or 4 days in Channapatna, and then for most weeks I would go to Bangalore, which is the closest city near Channapatna, and spend 2 days typically there, just reflecting on what had happened that particular week. So on any given day, I tried my best to write my field notes, type up my field notes that very night. That did not always happen because I typically had a full day of field work, but I did most of it. And even if I didn't get to all of it, I would make at least broad headers. And then I would finish typing up my field work at the end of the week, so my 2 days in Bangalore. And I also started analyzing my data while in the field during those 2 days. And those were the days that I found to be most important in terms of my thinking and sort of figuring out where the project was going to go. And most of my key ideas actually came on those days when I was away from my setting, because when I was in the field, I was just collecting data and everything felt normal. Only when I went away was it easy for me to see what's interesting about what I'm observing. So it's always a tricky question to figure out when one should leave the field. And the advice I have gotten very early on is, once you start feeling like you're hearing the same things over and over again when you talk to various informants, or if the patterns, if you're able to start predicting the patterns, of whatever it is that you're studying, then you've sort of got it. Like you've learned something, and there's not too much more information that you would learn if you spent 5 more days at that setting. And so for me, I've used that in several projects as my rule of thumb, and I think it's worked pretty well. And sometimes it takes only a few months, and sometimes it takes a year and a half to get to that point, depending on your setting. In this particular case, I was in the field for a year and a half in total, and 8 months in Channapatna. And towards the end, I felt like I really had a grasp around how artisans thought about economic decision making and setting prices. And I packed my bags and came back to Boston. For this particular project, and sort of this is similar to how I've done things in different projects, I left the field once I felt like I wasn't learning anything new. Where I felt like when I interviewed more artisans or traders, they were telling me very similar stories to what I'd heard before, and also that I was able to start predicting what their responses would be to these questions. And so that I've used as a useful rule of thumb in several projects, just to sort of, once you feel like you've exhausted that particular phenomenon that you're studying and you're seeing similar patterns, I think it's a sign that you've learned enough, and you maybe it's time to leave the field. So negotiating that process with your informants can be challenging because you don't know how long it's going to take. It's going to take you in the field. For some projects, you might be done in a few months, and for some other projects, it might take you much longer. And especially if we're doing things inductively, you might actually not know how much time you need to be in the field, and so it's challenging because initially a lot of people will ask you, how long are you going to be here? And I think I said, actually, I think I said about a year. In my case, it was actually very close to a year. But in some other projects, you might not have a good estimate of what that length of time is going to be. But it's easier. It was easier for me in my setting because my informants, the artisans and traders, saw it was a school project, so they weren't particularly concerned about she's hanging out with us for too long, or she's beginning to get on our nerves. I mean, they wanted to sort of help me for as long as they thought they were being helpful. So it didn't pose any challenges, but I did have people, at least towards the end, sort of wondering, how much longer I was going to be there and things like that. So I did go back for more data. I went back to actually do a field experiment. And so I tried to deductively test some of my key findings from my ethnographic observation. And so that happened pretty soon after I finished field work. But then 6 months later, I went back for 2 weeks because I had spent a few months analyzing the data and I had a few more questions. And then 6 months after that, I again went back for a week, similarly to tie up loose ends and sort of get clarity on some questions that I wasn't so sure about. So I'll move on to the next topic, which is analyzing your data. So I code my data using Atlas TI, and I found that to be great. And so I do line by line coding, and especially initially, I take the line by line coding very, very seriously because it is often really hard to figure out what's interesting in your field, and I feel in your setting. And I feel that doing sort of very systematic line by line coding has helped me often uncover interesting phenomena, even though while I was observing the phenomena or the specific pattern, it didn't seem interesting because it felt very normal in that setting. But sometimes when you code line by line, that's when you realize even though it's normal, it actually poses a puzzle to existing theory. So I've done that very systematically, and so I did a fair bit of coding while I was doing field work, and after I stopped field work, I then coded whatever I hadn't been able to get to while I was in the field. And so this is a tricky process. I feel like this is the hardest process in qualitative work. But I guess as long as you're persistent, even though there will be periods of uncertainty in the middle where you're not sure what you're studying really, I think for most people they do figure out what's interesting about their setting over time. Writing a paper from qualitative data is actually quite challenging because you'll have a lot of data and so many rich quotes, and then there's only 35 pages often that you can put in text in a paper for submission. And so going through that process of figuring out, what's going to make the paper, what's going to be in the paper, and what needs to be reserved for a different paper is actually quite difficult. And so, what I was advised early on was in this process, the first step is often to be able to tell the story, whatever is interesting in your particular setting, from the participants' point of view. So, how would they talk about price set? How would my artisans talk about how they set prices? That is being sort of the easiest thing to do. And then the one level above would be to then describe price setting from my own words. So, me as Aruna, how do I describe or understand artisans' price setting? So I'd say, oh, actually, artisans in Chanapatna often seem to give discounts to buyers who have a higher willingness to pay, such as foreigners, and this is really surprising. And so once I get to that level, then sort of the hardest part, which is the third level, is being able to tie this particular observation to existing theory. And so in the third stage, you're sort of telling that same story, but not to a person in the field, but to your fellow academics who are part of your academic audience for this particular finding. And so that can be quite hard because even if you've figured out your story, empirically what's interesting, there are often several audiences or several literatures that would be interested in that finding. And so it's really an iterative process to sort of keep going back and forth to figure out who the right audience is, and how you want to tell your story. So it's difficult, but I think with practice, it does get a little bit easier. So I'm still in the review process with respect to this particular piece, and one of the critiques I received through the review process is that I did not spend enough time and energy describing my setting and context, which is always difficult because to me it seems like just because I know the setting, it feels like I don't necessarily need to describe it in too much detail, but a reviewer often needs to know a lot about the setting to be able to evaluate your claims. And so it's still something I'm learning how to do, how to strike that right balance. So that I'm giving enough information to the reviewer to be able, for them to be able to assess my claims, but at the same time not bogging them down in details about the setting. So that is something that I'm trying to learn. And finally, what advice do I have for new ethnographers? So, firstly, I'm already happy that you're thinking of being an ethnographer, right? I guess two pieces really. The first one is when I started doing ethnographic fieldwork, I really struggled with the period of uncertainty when I did not know exactly what my question was and what was interesting in the field, and where I knew that the setting was broadly interesting, but I hadn't zeroed in on specifically what I was going to focus on, and that can be quite challenging because when you read research papers as an early grad student, it seems as if everything flows beautifully and everyone had a design going in, and it all came to them very easily. But at least whenever I've done field work, there's always this period in the middle, sort of early on, but then sometimes through the middle of the project where I'm still sort of just like I go in, I'm doing my bit, I'm observing, I'm typing up my field notes, but I'm still not completely sure what the story is going to be. And so I think my advice is to persevere through that. I mean, having now done this a few times, things always sort of work out, and there is always something interesting. It just takes time to figure out what it is, but don't get scared if you find yourself in that position. I guess the second piece of advice is to pick settings that you really care about, or phenomena that you really really are interested in, because you'll end up spending a lot of time studying the people and patterns in that particular context. And so, unless you care passionately about it, you're just not going to persevere and sort of dig out the most interesting story in that particular setting. And so, it definitely helps a lot if you are really interested in the settings that you study.